I would say easily one of my favorite tech house producers now is Ayybo. I mean, the dude does not miss. And so one of my favorite songs from him is Rizz. And so I actually downloaded an FL Studio remake and then I recreated that remake in Studio One from scratch. And so with that, I was able to learn a lot in terms of how Ayybo was able to produce that song. So there's really 9 main techniques that I learned with this, and so I'm going to share them all with you now, and hopefully they help you out because they've definitely helped me out. So let's dive into it. All right, so here we are in the project file, and I'll play just a little snippet of it just so you know what it sounds like in the project. So here we go. Yeah, so that's the song there. And really, like, the first thing that I learned is how to make that amazing sounding gliding bass. That is the #1 reason why I wanted to learn that song. So you can hear that super clearly if I solo it. I mean, it just sounds sick. It's so good. And really, the way that this gliding bass works is it's done through Serum. And so I did not sound design this. So when I downloaded the remake from FLP Studio, it comes with all of the Serum presets. So this is just from that. But I did learn how to make that gliding sound. So it's all done through this bottom right panel here. So you have to make sure that you have this mono button enabled as well as the legato button enabled. And then the other thing is you have to turn up this portamento slider until you get the timing of the glide that you want. And you can hear that when I turn down this portamento, the notes are a lot more discreet. So I'll show you what that means. So yeah, you could tell as I was turning it up, the glide started to take effect. And that's really how you make it. And then the only other piece of it is to get the MIDI notes to actually do the glide. And so the way that that works is when you're programming the MIDI, if you want the notes to sound discreetly and if you want the notes to not glide, then there has to be a clear separation between the notes, like what you see with the first 3 notes. So if I play just the first 3 notes, you'll hear that they're just discrete. All right, there's no glide. The way you make a glide is you can see here, this note extends for the full beat here, but then this other note gets added and is kind of overlaid underneath of this. And so basically, this note will glide into this one. Now this one is also overlaid onto it. So this top note will glide into this one, which will then glide into this one, and then it'll shoot back up to these 2 notes because there's no glide here, because this note is separate from these. There's nothing overlying on top of this one. So if I loop this, you'll hear it more clearly. And yeah, so that's the first thing I learned is how to make that awesome gliding bass. Okay, the second thing that I learned is that there's really not a lot of tonal sounds in here. Like all of this blue here is entirely percussion. And so when I look at this, the only things that are actually providing tonal sounds are the bass and the saxophone that you can hear in the intro. But the saxophone only comes on in certain parts of the song. So for the bulk of the song, it's literally just the bass that's carrying those tonal elements. Everything else is percussion, which is absolutely wild. I mean, I'll play the big bulk of this song here, which is probably right here, and you'll hear that other than the bass, everything else you hear is really just percussion. I mean, yes, the vocals are adding some tonal nature to it, but other than that, everything else is percussion. And so for me, this was really eye-opening because most of the songs I've ever made in the past had a lot more tonal elements than they did percussive elements. And so just to see like the sheer number of percussion elements here, to me is just staggering. So that's something that I learned, is that you don't need a lot of tonal elements to make a really powerful song. Sometimes you just need a really driving bass line, and then everything else can be mostly percussion and maybe a little bit of another instrument to add some tonal flair. Like you can hear there is some saxophone here. But then again, it's also not a lot. I mean, it's not like you're seeing fleshed out chords or anything like that. I mean, the things that are providing tonal elements other than the bass, they're pretty minor. And so, yeah, this was just something that was pretty eye-opening to me. Okay, the third thing I learned is something I already mentioned, but there is a lot of percussion going on in this song. Like way more than I've typically used in any of my songs before. Like you have your standard kicks, your claps, your shaker loops, but then you get into interesting things like this drum loop percussion. And then you have like these sort of conga sounding things. And then you even have this kind of triangle adding some kind of background sparkle. And so like what's interesting is when you listen to those percussion elements on their own, they sound really out of place and really offbeat. But as soon as I add the kick in, it just makes so much sense. And so what I'll do, which might be helpful, is I'm just going to loop this and I'm just going to slowly add in each of these percussive tracks so that you can see how they build on each other and how it ultimately creates this cohesive piece. So let's go ahead and do that. And yeah, so this, again, I learned so much just by seeing how all of these percussive layers just work together, and it's definitely something I'm going to implement in future songs of mine. Okay, the fourth thing that I learned is that something changes pretty much every 4 bars. So if you look at the drop here, you have these 4 bars, and then you have the next 4 bars, but there's something different. You have this little shout here. And then when you look at the next 4 bars, you have the introduction of bongos. When you look at the next 4 bars, you have the introduction of the hi-hat and the percussion. So basically, this just allows things to build. It allows it allows me just to be more interested because there's just always something changing. Whereas I feel like when I've made songs in the past, I would often have like 8 bars, 16 bars where nothing really changes. But here, like something changes every 4 bars. You have different like automations that happen that change, like here.
Oh, wonderful.
And so like I think this just keeps the listener interested and just makes them from not being bored. And so this is a really crucial thing that I'll take with me, is to try to have something change every 4 bars if possible, even if it's just something. And again, like these are small things. Like none of these are really large. Like in the grand context of things, you might not even notice like this open hi-hat here versus playing here. I mean, you might as a producer, but as just an average listener, they're not even going to notice that. But it just adds a little bit of intrigue and interest that I think just carries the song forward. All right, the fifth thing I learned is similar to number 4, but whenever I think of a drop, I think of just like everything happening, everything is all in. All the elements that you would want present are like there. But that's not really the case in this song. So you can hear, like, even though this is technically the drop, it still builds, like what I was talking about before. So every 4 measures, there's something being added, whether it's these bongos, whether it's the hi-hat, this other hi-hat that comes in here, the saxophone that comes in at this part. Like in my mind, all of this, the drop is the drop, but even the drop itself builds and builds and builds and builds, which to me is just really cool and just shows that you can have a song that essentially kind of like builds throughout the entire thing, which is really interesting. And again, I think just adds to the intrigue of listening to it. Number 6 is really interesting. So every single section of this song is exactly the same. Now, some parts of it might be filtered, some parts of it might have elements added or taken away, but it's all exactly the same. So take a listen. Like, yes, I mean, the saxophone adds a lot to kind of add in the variation, but the backbone of the song is entirely the same. Like, the bass groove doesn't change. A lot of the drum elements are pretty much the same. There's not like what I would consider like a B section where there's some sort of thematic change in the song. It's all just entirely the same thing, which again is sort of a new concept for me as someone who came from writing pop music. And I would have this you'd have this verse section and the chorus section, and they would sound pretty different from one another. But here, really the main difference is that the builds are filtered and the drops are not. And that's pretty much it. And to me, that's really cool that you can create something that's so dynamic, but also be so simple at the same time. All right, number 7. So I learned some interesting automation tricks. Now, I have used and implemented the idea of putting like a low cut filter on the track, on the intro of a track like this, and then basically having it get removed as you go into the drop. Like, I've done that before, so that part wasn't super new to me, but an interesting thing is to maybe have the drums being high cut in the beginning, like this. So if I turn this off, it sounds like this. It sounds much more cool to have them high cut. So that was sort of an interesting thing that I learned. So that's definitely something that I'll be implementing. But one other kind of interesting thing is that one thing that I've never automated is the mix of the reverb. So you can hear that as this goes into the build, this clap will increase the reverb of the clap will start to increase. So that's pretty cool because it adds like, it almost adds like this effect that the track is almost fading away once it gets to this piece of silence and then it all comes back in. So that's a very interesting way to have some automation, or an interesting element to automate. Now, the other thing that I thought was cool is that they use automations as transitions. So if you listen to this part here, you'll hear what it basically adds in that low cut filter for the whole instrument track. And it to go into the next section. So you'll hear that here. Now they could have had Ayybo could have had like an interesting fill here. He could have had some effects noise, but instead all he did was add this low cut filter, and it was all that was needed, a very simple choice to go into the next part of the song. And he does that a lot. Like, you'll hear that like in this section. So yeah, he utilizes a lot of that filter technique, as well as just cutting things out for about half a measure to transition into the next piece of the song. Okay, the eighth thing that I learned. There's not really a lot of effects being used in this track. And by effects, I mean like effect sounds. Like there's this one in the beginning here, which sounds like this. But other than that, I mean, you can see like all of the effects are in this kind of green color here, except this one, which should be green. But all the effects are kind of in that green color. And there's really not a lot going on. Like this is just vinyl noise that goes out through the whole thing. So I don't really count that as an effect. But I'm talking about like risers and impacts and things like that. And there's not much of it. Like there's one here. But it's also very faint. Like it's not overbearing. And I think the reason why he's able to not have a lot of that effects is because he uses a lot of those automations that I was talking about earlier. And so when you're doing like a low cut filter on the whole track, it sort of adds that, it kind of does the same thing of having like an effects. Like there's going to be something different happening if you hear the whole bass just being low cut. But here's what the effects uplifters sound like together. So there's that. And I'd say like the biggest example of it is here, which I'll play. So just on the second build there, so you can hear what this sounds like together. I'll play them one at a time. So that one's kind of like a panned white noise. This one I think is more tonal. Okay, I lied. It's not tonal. It's also just more white noise. So together it sounds like... But again, like when you hear it in the context of the track, it's not overbearing like some songs. And so yeah, I think it's just a really... Because again, this is something that I feel like I maybe overuse a lot when I try to transition from one thing to the next. Is I'll use a lot of effects risers and impacts to try to kind of glue together the different parts of my song. But this is, to me, is just a really good example of, hey, you don't need to do that. And in fact, you can utilize other things like implementing automations of maybe hitting the low cut filter, and you can kind of do the same thing. Okay, the last thing that I learned is also something really important. So for the songs that I've done in the past, a lot of times I've used the same drop for the first drop and then the second drop. And if you played them one back to back, they wouldn't really sound any different. But what I really like that Ayybo does is that for the second drop, there's no clap. And it just, even though it's just one element taken away, because the clap is such a primary element, it just sounds so different. So I'm gonna play the drop with the clap, and then I'll play the build into the no clap drop.
I'm in this bitch, been up 2 days, now I hit the switch, let's go.
Again, it's just like, it's one element, but for some reason it just sounds so much more different. And I think it's because the clap has been present pretty much throughout the entire song. And so to hear a section where it drops out, it almost sounds like an entirely new section, even though, again, like all the other elements are pretty much exactly the same. It's just the clap has been taken away. And so again, it's like, I think the main theme that I'm learning from this song is that, you can essentially have the main skeleton or the main musical theme throughout the entire song, but just add in different elements, take away different elements, filter out certain things. And so if you do that, you can essentially have the same musical motif throughout the whole thing, but with adding and removing elements and filtering out things, you can create sort of a build and drop, and have a lot of dynamics to sort of carry you through and not get bored. So yeah, hopefully you found this to be helpful. I definitely learned quite a bit from this project, and it's definitely something that I'm going to be taking with me. If you like these kinds of videos, definitely let me know. And if you're interested, the website that I got these from, I'll just quickly show you, is called FLP Studio. So this is where I download my FL Studio remakes. Now, I don't use FL Studio, but it's just, well, they have Ableton, Logic Pro, and FL Studio. So I decided to do FL Studio because it's the cheapest DAW. And then here's the FL Studio project. And then I literally just remake it from scratch in Studio One, which is my DAW. And again, it gives me just a lot of, I learn a lot when I do this recreation process. And I have a whole other video that kind of goes more in depth about this process if you're interested. But yeah, I think that's all I have for this one, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.